Good to go. Hopefully you can see me and hear me. Welcome to CIEEM's webinar on the climate crisis and first steps for ecologists. So I'm just going to share my screen. I just wanted you to know that I was a real person. And okay, let's see if this works. Hopefully you can see my slides now. Does that look all right?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay. So, I don't seem to. I think, have you still got control of this?
No, I don't.
Number? No, I'm not able to. We've got our first glitch, everybody. I'm not able to move my slides on, unfortunately. Let's see if this works. Hopefully you can still see my screen, can you? Can you see that?
It's unshared now.
Is that looking good?
Yep, that's good.
Great. Right. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with us while we sorted that little glitch out. Anyway, yes, so I'm Melody Stokes. I'm a senior ecologist at Balfour Beatty Vinci. I used to be, in a previous life, a mechanical engineer, and I worked in the car industry. But later on, I got involved with the green sector, particularly in energy efficiency and renewable energy. So I've worked in a lot of different aspects of the sector, everything from a little charitable organisation called the National Energy Foundation. I worked at the Energy Saving Trust, and I was part of the government scheme to help local authorities develop their strategic approaches to climate change. And I've also, for my sins, worked in the Eon Sustainable Energy team. So I practice what I preach. I managed to reduce my own carbon footprint in my house by 70%. And I've got another house which is off-grid in Shropshire. So I really enjoy this aspect of things, and I hope I can enthuse you as well. So I switched to ecology quite late in life, and I'm now concerned about the impacts of climate change on wildlife. I mean, good and bad, we'll have a little look at that. And I'm also keen to see how ecology can play a part in solving some of those issues. So that's me, and I'm kind of delighted to be involved in this because it brings together the two aspects of my working life, which is, you know, the carbon side of it and ecology. So that's me. Amber, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Amber Connett, and I'm the Policy and Communications Officer for CIEEM. So I lead on our response to the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, and I facilitate our Action 2030 group, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. So that's me.
So this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be thinking about the crisis that we're now facing in terms of climate change, in terms of global warming, carbon emissions and biodiversity. They're all separate, but they're interrelated aspects of the crisis. And then I'm going to hand over to Amber, and she's going to explain what CIEEM's doing, and in particular the work of our Action 2030 committee over the past few months. Then I'll explain something about the context. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the history of carbon trading and where carbon reporting came from, because it's been around for quite a long while really, and just wanted to put that in context for you. After that, we'll have a little look at the three scopes. That might not mean anything to you at this stage, but hopefully it will by the end, that are used for carbon emissions, scopes 1, 2 and 3, and what they cover, and how you'd use that for reporting. We'll have a short video that talks about how the scopes work, and then we'll have a little look about how it might apply to ecology businesses. After that, we'll take a couple of questions. We'll have a little break in the middle for a couple of questions. So if you can put any questions that you have as you go along in the chat facility, then we'll pick up maybe the meatiest ones, perhaps two that I'm able to answer midway. Then I will go through a brief process that you might want to think about using to tackle your company's carbon emissions. And then Amber will look at how that relates to CIEEM, so we can sort of give you a bit of an explanation of how CIEEM have applied that to carbon emissions. And then we'll take a few more questions before wrapping up at the end. So we may go over the hour a little bit. If you want to head off for the weekend, feel free to do that. But you know, if you're available and you want to stick with it, then by all means do. I'll try and be as brief as I can. There's quite a lot of material to cover. And there is a bit of audience participation during the webinar, so don't groan about that. It's quite straightforward. There's really 3 points at which we'll ask you a question. And we would like some feedback from you, because we'll sort of tailor this presentation to suit, you know, people's knowledge who are in the audience. So to respond to that, I believe, I've never used this technology, but I believe a poll comes up and then you just press the right button and we'll see what the majority response is. So that's pretty much what we're hoping to cover in this hour, a little bit more than an hour to be honest. So let's get cracking. What's the crisis that's on our hands at the moment? It requires urgent action from us all, and it's easily, I think, the most challenging set of circumstances that as a species we have ever faced. So I don't want to be a Greta Thunberg here, but I just want to go through a few items. So what we're looking at here is a map that was created by the Carbon Brief, and they started to log extreme weather events starting in the early 2000s. And then they got scientists sort of peer review to see whether these events were linked to man-made causes or they were natural events. And they cover things like hurricanes, droughts, flooding, severe cold, extreme heat, large-scale fires, coral bleaching, warming seas, you know, it's all in there. And this map shows 355 extreme events that were investigated. And of these, 78% were in some way affected by man-made influences. So it's a global issue, it's very serious, and we're really the cause of it. This graph here is published on the NASA website, and it shows loss events that have been reported through one of the biggest insurance companies, Munich Re. And it shows an upward trend over the past 40 years in claims, you know, as a result of these extreme events. They combine meteorological events, hydrological events, and that makes up the bulk of it. And even just the climate-related events that you can see, there's an increase in that. So it's not just people suffering, people are suffering from these quite extreme events, but, you know, for businesses, it means financial loss as well. So that's climate change. Let's look a little bit at global warming. So again, this is a NASA graph, and it's showing the average temperature at the surface from the 1880s through to pretty much the current time. Global warming is sort of the long-term heating of the Earth's climate system due to human activity. So this is just what we're responsible for. Climate change tends to include natural events as well. And you can see from the graph that the average temperature at the surface between pre-industrial revolution era, about 1850 to 1900, and current times has gone up by 1 degree C. And it continues to rise at a quite steep rate of 0.2 degrees per decade. And most of that warming has come since the 1950s, and it's due to human impacts. So the big challenge here, it doesn't seem like a lot, does it? But that's the average temperature over the surface. And obviously in certain parts of the world, we're going to see far bigger increases than that. So it's averaged out. The big challenge really is to limit this rise to 1.5 degrees, because after that, we're pretty sure that it's all going to run out of control, and it will have devastating effects. So that's the target that everybody's working to, and it requires an enormous amount of change and an enormous amount of effort on the part of all of us to keep that below 1.5 degrees. So since we're saying that, you know, these events are caused by us, most of those events are caused by us creating greenhouse gases, and a big part of that is burning fossil fuels, with an outcome that we're creating carbon dioxide emissions. So it's not doom and gloom, this is a bit more of a cheery graph. So I like this one because it's showing that in the UK, we've taken a lot of actions to try and address these things, and they are starting to work. So that you can see carbon emissions went up from, you know, the mid 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution kicked off and we really started in earnest to burn coal and coke and so on, kept going up. And then since the 1980s, when we've been starting to take urgent action on this, it has actually started to come down. And the biggest drivers for that are that we're burning far less coal and oil in our power stations, still burning gas, but we've replaced our sources of power and heat to some extent from renewable energy. So, you know, you'll see huge wind farms, marine wind farms, and the big banks of solar panels. And they really are having quite an effect, and increased energy efficiency and so on. So that's a cheery news. We are doing something to address this, and it's, you know, it's starting to work, but we've still got to keep going and do an awful lot more. So I just wanted to mention COVID, the COVID lockdown and the impact that it's had, because you know, we have managed to reduce emissions as a result of that. It's not been all bad, I suppose, but they say that as a result of lockdown, then globally we reduced emissions by 17%. We think, and that's equivalent to 17 million tonnes of carbon dioxide globally. So that gives you an idea of the extent of the action that we have to take. You know, we're not going to be able to live with a lockdown situation, but it's that degree of change in our lives that's got to happen in order to have a real impact on climate change. So what about nature then? Obviously a changing climate changes where wildlife can exist. Different patterns of weather affecting you know, where their ranges and the size of the populations. This particular graph is looking at invasive species, and it's looking at the number of invasive non-native species that are established in or along 10% or more of the land area in Great Britain or coastline between 1960 and 2018. So you can see in freshwater, marine and terrestrial habitats, there's been quite a significant increase in the number of invasive species because they're moving into Great Britain as a result of our changing climate. So that can be good and bad. We've got a nice picture of a red admiral butterfly here, which represents the fact that some species that didn't used to are now choosing to overwinter in the UK. But then there's things like this. I was on Dunwich Heath, which is a lovely part of the world in Suffolk, a couple of weeks ago, and these lowland habitats, these lowland heaths, will likely diminish because of drought, and the weather patterns are going to change how the habitats look and the sort of wildlife that supports. And native trees may become increasingly overwhelmed by pests and diseases. So, you know, our wildlife, the level of diversity is likely to drop. So that's the other part of the crisis as well. So you can see that those four things are quite well interlinked, really. That was just a brief introduction. So before we sort of get cracking on carbon emissions and how you might take the first steps to reduce your carbon footprint, we'd like to run the first poll. So the question is, are you already taking actions yourself to reduce your carbon emissions? And the options are, yes, I'm doing it at home, or yes, I'm doing it at work, or C, you're doing it at both places, or, you know, don't be worried about this. There's no, we're not going to beat you with a stick if you're saying not yet, because you have to start somewhere. So if you can just do the poll. I don't think I can because it doesn't click, but hopefully that's working, is it?
Yes, it's working. Yeah, people are making their choices, so I'll end the poll in a few seconds.
Okay.
And share the results.
Click your buttons now. This is exciting. What have we got? So 56%. I didn't say, but actually we were expecting 209 people on this webinar, so that's quite a good chunk of ecologists interested in this topic. But and that's good to see, isn't it? 56% of people say that you're doing something about your carbon emissions at home and at work. And if you're not doing it at work, then 36% are busy doing it at home. And 4% very honest people said well, I'm not quite doing it yet, but hopefully by the end of this, you definitely will be. So thanks very much for that. Then I don't have to convert you, do I? You're already on this, so well done. I'm pleased to hear that. Now my slides have got locked up and I can't move on now. Is anybody else able to move my slides on?
Melody, sometimes it gets a bit sleepy, so if you just click on the screen and then try an arrow.
Yes.
There you go, it wakes it up a bit.
Oh, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Amber now. She's going to tell you what we're all doing in CIEEM on the Action 2030 committee. So Amber, take it away.
Thank you, Melody. So just to start with a little bit of background on our Action 2030 project. So you may have seen, Melody, do I have control of the slides? There we go. So you may have seen in 2019, we, like many other organisations, declared a climate emergency and biodiversity crisis. In doing so, we recognise that these are inextricably linked and we cannot address one without addressing the other as well. And they can't also be fully understood without reference to social issues. So alongside our declaration and call to action, we published a briefing paper on the two crises, sort of explaining how they are linked. And acknowledging that nature-based solutions must play a key role in mitigating against and adapting to climate change, as well as reversing ongoing declines in biodiversity. So both of these are available on our resources hub on our website. So we followed that up with a briefing paper on nature-based solutions, looking at what they are, how they work, and their implementation. And this is also available on our resource hub. And since then, IUCN have also published a global standard on nature-based solutions. So taking a look at the project, so from the declaration, we committed to a series of actions to address the joint crises as an institute, most notably committing to reaching net zero by 2030 and setting up a working group called Action 2030 to help us on our journey. So the main objectives of Action 2030 are to challenge us as an organisation to reach our goal of net zero, identify ways in which we can lead change in the profession to address the crises, provide advice to our members on addressing the crises together. They promote nature-based solutions and they build relationships with other organisations and similar working groups in those other organisations. So the first sort of arm of the group then is leading the change in the profession. So the group have presented a range of recommendations on how we can do this to address the joint crises. And our governance committees have reviewed these and agreed to review the competency framework in 2021 to 2022 to ensure that it adequately addresses both the crises and highlights any potential gaps. Reviewing our training offerings to ensure that our programme covers all aspects of the crises, and then encouraging reflection on if and how your continued professional development addresses the crises. So on this, we'll also be offering free webinars such as this one, templates for reporting carbon emissions, and letters that you can send to providers to encourage them to consider and alter their practices. We also intend to run a carbon neutral pledge campaign, but this will not be a compulsory part of membership. This is just to get the conversations going amongst our membership. So the next sort of arm of the group then is the advice to members. So this covers a range of topics, for example, considerations in their advice to clients, using an ecosystem approach and looking at the carbon footprint of habitat interventions, looking at the carbon sequestration and value of habitats. So the group identified a need for updated evidence on this topic, and there'll hopefully be an In Practice article coming in the March edition of In Practice. Also looking at materials and methods, so the use of plastics in surveys, and then looking at the carbon footprint of survey methods themselves. So there will be an In Practice article of this in September's edition. Also looking at organisational management, so this is business travel, the suppliers and the pension. And then finally signposting to personal actions that you may want to take forward outside of your work life as well. So all of this advice will be published on our Action 2030 web pages, so we have a useful resources web page there for you. So I will hand back over to Melody now.
Brilliant, thank you, Amber. So you can see we've been pretty busy. The committee was only set up earlier this year, so we've done quite a lot so far, I think. So, okay, carrying on then, just wanted to put, just very briefly, give you some context really about carbon reporting. I think my committee members on the Action 2030 group were surprised that really it had been around as long as it has, and it's really applied to larger businesses. So, yeah, it started in Rio. Most people on this webinar might not even been alive then, I don't know, but I certainly was, and I remember it very well. That back in 1992 then, 180 countries came together, and that was really when they really first realised that something was going seriously wrong. You know, people had talked about climate change and global warming and so on, but it really started to come together in 1992. And people called for action. It was a time when, you know, when you were concerned about such things, you were considered to be tree huggers and cranks, I think. But they took it seriously from that point onwards, and came together and created a pledge called Agenda 21, and that really started to address carbon emissions, reporting, tackling things, monitoring it, and so on. That led to a growing desire to measure greenhouse gas emissions and to start to set targets for reduction. And typically they were set as a percentage reduction over a baseline in 1990, and tended to extend for a period into the far distant future. So our own country has got a target of getting to, I think, 80% of 1990 levels by 2050. And I don't think I'll necessarily still be around by then, but you know, you might be. So I think the longer in the distance these things are, you know, the less importance in a way they have. You know, it just doesn't feel real. So I'm glad that people are now starting to talk about 2030, 10 years away. That has a lot more meaning, doesn't it? So after that period, then the EU trading scheme was set up, and they realised that, you know, if they didn't have financial motivation really to get involved with carbon emissions, it might never happen. So the biggest emitters of carbon started to sort of trade their emissions. So if they were able to make reductions in a certain year, they could sell certificates for their emissions to other people and make money out of that. So that was the EU ETS scheme that was set up in 2005. And in 2012, that then got extended in the UK to a similar kind of scheme, I suppose, under the carbon reduction commitment. And that started to target the top sort of 1,100 listed companies and all of the public authorities. And they then had to declare what their emissions were, and had to declare a plan on how they were going to reduce it. And I remember it well because I was sat in advising Birmingham City Council at the time, and it was really, really big thing. We were starting to pull together all of their, you know, energy use. You know, it really kick-started a huge campaign, and Birmingham City Council were already on it anyway, but it was a huge piece of work that went across all these different companies across the country. And it really spearheaded a lot of it, incentivised people to start taking action. So that scheme carried on. Then in 2016, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was launched by the World Resources Institute, and they began to move away from setting a baseline. You know, so they kind of did away with having to look at your baseline in 1990 and figure out how much you wanted to reduce. They just encouraged people, as CIEEM have done, to sort of say, do you know what, we're just going to cut to zero emissions by a certain date. And most people now are picking up 2030 as the target date. So that really came out by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in 2016. And then just last year, the government announced a slightly simpler scheme for reporting. It's the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, or SECR scheme. And that was introduced by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, as they are now. And that replaced the carbon reduction commitment, and it affects 11,900 registered businesses. It's aimed at large companies, so you may work for some of them. It's sort of companies with 250 staff or over 360 million turnover, so sizable companies, and it includes listed and unlisted companies and trusts and charities. So, you know, it's coming to a lot of organisations. And the government's encouraging those not covered to take part voluntarily. You know, even if you're a small business with just one or two people, you know, you can use the same formula to figure out what your carbon footprint is and what you want to do about it. It's a difficult process. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. Hopefully by the end of this you'll have an idea of how to go about it. But the thinking has evolved, and when I think back to the early days when we were doing the carbon reduction commitment, it was an absolute blooming nightmare, and it was really difficult to get your head around it. And this stuff shouldn't be difficult. It shouldn't hinder you in taking the next steps to reduce your carbon footprint, both in your personal carbon emissions and those of your businesses. So I'm going to say that it's as easy as 1, 2, 3, but that's because there's 3 scopes. There's, in reporting carbon emissions, there's scopes 1, 2 and 3, and I just wanted to get a feel from you all as to how many people already understand this framework, because if you do, then I won't labour it, but if you're new to all of this, then I'd be interested to know. So how much do you know about scope 1, 2 and 3 carbon emissions? So option A is yes, I use it to report for my business. Yes, I've come across it before, but maybe you're not involved in using it. You've sort of heard of it. That's option C. Maybe you've heard of it, but you don't really know what it is. And D is no, I don't really know what you're talking about. So if you can just hit your buttons, we'll see what you all know. How are we doing?
Yeah, I'll end the polling now and share the results with you.
Okie doke. Ooh, okay, that's good. That's good, you won't get bored then. So 76% say you've not heard of this before. We've got 12% who think, yes, that's sort of on the periphery of my knowledge, and 10% yes, know about it, and 2% are actually using it for your business. So well done, those people. Okay, thank you. So next bit, and I might need to do a bit of jiggery-pokery with the old technology for this, but I'm going to show you a video. It's a quirky little video that I found. It's by an Indian chap called Dr. Haroon Junaidi. He's set up an organisation called Synergy, and he's very pleased to allow us to see his film that he's created. It's a little cartoon. It lasts about 5 minutes, and it was really the most palatable way that I could find to introduce this to you, rather than sort of labouring through a whole lot of slides. So I might have to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to share it again because I want to make sure that you hear the sound. Otherwise you'll just be seeing the pictures, won't you? So I'm going to escape from that, I think. How can I do that? I'm going to stop sharing again. Sorry about this. Right, I've got the video up. Now I'm going to share it again. So you can see my screen, hopefully. Put that on maximum. Can you see this?
Yep.
Welcome to this lecture on the scope of greenhouse gas or GHG emissions. In this lecture, we will cover what are the activities and resources that are included in estimating an organization's total emissions. In many countries, it is compulsory to report the greenhouse gas emissions on an yearly basis. To make the results more reliable and consistent, a framework has been developed by the World Resources Institute called the Ghe Protocol. The Ghe Protocol breaks down the scope of emissions into 3 parts. These are namely Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 are the direct emissions, while Scope 2 and 3 are the indirect emissions. In Scope 1, we account for the emissions that result because of direct burning of fossil fuel on site. They also include any refrigerant leak on site. Similarly, emissions resulting from the use of organizations' vehicles are also included in Scope 1. Lastly, any emissions due to the process on site, for instance ammonia release or other gas release, are also accounted for in Scope 1. Just to sum up, the thing to remember about Scope 1 is that it accounts for all on-site emissions and also includes emissions by vehicles based on that site. Scope 2 is the indirect energy emission because of energy usage, mainly electricity usage. An organization may use electricity which doesn't generate emissions on site. However, the creation of electricity and its distribution results in emissions that are off-site, that is, in a power plant. It should be noted that electricity emissions vary greatly because of the fuel used to produce electricity. For example, coal produces the most emissions because it's not a clean fuel. Electricity can also be generated from heavy furnace, oil or gas, which are relatively cleaner. The cleanest source of electricity is renewables. Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions. Scope 3 emissions are often the largest category and can account up to 80% of an organization's emissions. However, they are often overlooked and underreported. They are all other emissions that are a result of organizations' activity other than on-site fuel use, on-site emissions, and electricity usage. So things like emissions for purchased goods and services, capital goods, waste generation, employee commuting, and business travel are just a few of the 15 categories that are included in Scope 3. For the sake of simplification, we divide Scope 3 emissions into two categories, namely upstream and downstream emissions. Suppose your organization produces a product, and let's say that product is a table. All the emissions that result in acquisition of wood and other materials, nail, paint, varnish, etc., and its transportation to the site are upstream Scope 3 emissions. The table is made, which results in a lot of wood chip and sawdust waste. This wastage will also be accounted for in the upstream emissions unless recycled. Then the table is shipped to all the distribution centers. The emissions that result because of the distribution of the table and its disposal once it's thrown away are downstream emissions. So a big question at this point would be, what are the emissions that are not included in Scope 1, 2, and 3? Well, suppose you run a supermarket. The customers that come to your supermarket use cars and purchase items. The customer's CO2 emissions because of their traveling are not included in any scope. It is something that is beyond the control of the organization. What Scope 1, 2, and 3 allow us to do is to identify the emissions which have our highest influence, namely all emissions under the Scope 1 and 2. This categorization also allows us to identify emission hotspots. Many of these hotspots may lie in Scope 3, by the way. Once the hotspots are identified, then the organization can focus on reducing them to improve business efficiency. It is very common to have the 80-20 rule even in the case of GHG emissions, that is, 20% of the organization's activity may result in 80% of its emissions. Experts have suggested that it is often the purchased goods and services in the Scope 3 category that account for the highest emissions. If the Ghe Protocol is understood properly, then one can easily estimate the CO2 emission of an organization. There are, however, carbon accounting firms and carbon accounting softwares available to help you in this regard.
To respond, we've got an advert crept in there, so I'm going to go back to the presentation now. If I can find it. So, hope that made a bit of sense. It's probably better listening, seeing a few cartoons and so on, than it is just going through slides. But right, I'm going to share my screen again now. Does this work?
Yes, that looks good.
Right. So that's a brief introduction then to the three scopes, and the idea was that they're in order of your ability to control them. So Scope 1 emissions were things that were directly under your control as a business. Scope 2 was sort of under your control, but you depended on other people supplying you with energy. And scope 3 is sort of out there in your supply chain, so that's a little bit more difficult, really. So that was the thinking behind it. And initially, when all of this kicked off, then the people were just sort of concentrating first on scope 1 and then on scope 2 activities. That's how it all came about, really. So let's just have a little look, and let's try and apply this perhaps to an imaginary ecology, a small ecology consultancy perhaps. So let's think about scope 1 then. This relates to anything that you actually own on your site. So I mean, you may own your own vans, vehicles, cars. You might own your own boiler. So it's thinking about you know, getting energy data for your boiler. It might be a gas or oil boiler, and you figure out how much you're using in a given year, how many miles you're doing on your own vehicles, and how much petrol or diesel you're using, and that counts as your scope 1. So, you know, it's usually easy to get hold of that kind of data. So scope 1 is generally, you know, something that you can do something about, and it's something that you can get the data for. Scope 2 then would cover you getting energy from suppliers. So typically it covers your energy, your electricity purchase, grid electricity from your electricity supplier. It covers any heat that you're receiving. So that might be that you're buying in gas, you're buying in oil, Cala gas, whatever. Or you might be buying heat in from your landlord. So you might actually have a heat meter. You might be getting heat from a district energy scheme. It's that kind of thing. You might be buying in cooling. You might get cold water coming in from another system. So again, it's not beyond the wit of man to gather your usage data, your consumption data over a period of a year and figure out what your carbon emissions from that. So far, it's not too difficult. But then when we go on to the next one, that's when it becomes interesting. So let's look at the scope 3 ones. Now you're sort of looking partly to your supply chain, partly in-house. And it's, to be honest, for an ecology consultancy business or most ecology businesses, I would say this is where the largest chunk of your carbon emissions is likely to come from. Certainly the case with CIEEM. And it's also the most difficult. It's split into upstream and downstream. If you make products for your customers, then the upstream category is going to apply. So, you know, that's less important if you're running an ecology consultancy service, but there are things in there that you might want to take account of. So you've got things like leased assets. So if you've got leased vehicles, then you need to be thinking about your fuel usage in leased vehicles in this category. You will be thinking about employee commuting, so you need to ask your staff how far they travel to keep a note of that, what their mileage is, what sort of cars they've got, what sort of fuel they're using. You need to think about business travel and figure out, you know, how many miles you're doing on a train, how many air miles you've got. You need to think about your tonnage of waste materials, that sort of information you might be able to get from your waste contractor. Think about, probably won't have transportation and distribution costs. You won't have fuel and energy related to production of products unless you're making something. You know, you might be making some device that's being used in, I don't know, ecology surveys or something. You probably won't have capital goods, but you will have your water usage would fall into this category. And if you've got solar panels, renewable energy and so on, then there's a small amount, if you're buying in green electricity, there's a tiny little bit of emissions related to the fact that you're buying it in, but it's actually that energy is being created remotely, you know, in a marine wind farm or something. And there's a little bit of carbon associated with the fact that that's being transmitted and distributed to your site. So those are the kinds of things that happen in scope 3. And you need to work with your supply chain, in many cases, to figure out what their services and what their products that you're using in your businesses, what the emissions associated with that, what the carbon association is with the products that you're buying. So we'll have a little break now. Just like to take a couple of questions, if we've got some. How are we looking, Amber? Is there a question?
Yeah, we've got one in at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's, do you have to record electricity usage in scope 2 if it's renewable?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? There's two schools of thought there. That you should record it, you should show it, because you are using electricity, and you know, you are encouraged to use less, even though you're generating it yourself. You know, if you've got solar panels on your business, it's better that you use less, because what you're not using, you could export into the grid and help green the grid, if you like. But on the other hand, you as a business, you know, you've covered your emissions by using your own renewable energy, or buying in green electricity. So you should show it in scope 2 as electricity being used, but then show a deduction, because in fact, if that makes sense, you know, so it is zero at the end of the day. So if you're showing that as a line item in your scope 2 emissions, it ends up being zero, but it's better to show it as something that you're using and then something that you're not using, because you're buying in green electricity. And I think we're going to cover that a little bit, because that's exactly what CIEEM does. There is that little bit that I mentioned, that if you're not generating your own electricity and you're buying it in, so that you're buying green electricity effectively, and it is entirely from renewable sources through your energy supplier, there's a tiny little bit of emissions that goes with that distribution and transmission. So there is actually an emissions factor that covers that as well. So there's a little bit, and that goes in your scope 3. So I hope that makes sense. Anything else?
No, that's it so far.
Okay, well, we'll press on then. So where do you start with all of this? You know, it sounds, you know, it kind of sounds easy. I hope I've made it sound easy anyway, just to encourage you along. But, you know, I know full well, you know, having sat in Birmingham City Council, that when you actually get started on all of this, it's actually quite difficult. So the best thing with difficult processes is to break it down into lots of little chunks, and it doesn't seem quite so bad then. So I wanted to go through, you know, a potential process that you might like to adopt that's fairly standard for all of these things. And I guess it's obvious, but I thought I'd go through it with you anyway. So the first thing you need to do is to decide on your boundaries. So you might be a group of businesses, or even if you're a small outfit, maybe you want to start by looking at one part of your organisation. Perhaps you provide lots of different services, you know, an ARB service or a survey service or something like that. You might just choose to look at one particular area just to get the process going, and then you can always broaden it out once you've got it sorted for one particular part of the business. But you need to sort of think about the boundaries of what you're going to be looking at. Next, it's always easier if you do this as a team. You know, there's quite a lot of data that you're going to need. If you bring a few people together, sort of a crack team, you know, people who are really enthusiastic about this, they can share the data gathering, and you can support each other. And ideally elect a champion, somebody, you know, who's really passionate about this. Maybe in the old days, it always tended to be somebody with financial responsibility, because the cunning plan was that, you know, you kind of wanted to make people realise that cutting carbon usually means saving money. But initially, it usually requires a little bit of an investment to do it. So it was quite common to, you know, have your financial director as the champion. They sometimes took a bit of persuading, but once you'd done it, you know, they were sort of fully on board, because they were passionate about saving money as well as the carbon. They often, you know, financial people often have access to the energy bills, and that's really where you want to start in terms of gathering information. I mean, if you're a one-man band, then obviously you're going to be the champion in a team of one. But, you know, if you can form a group of helpful people around you, that's always a good place to be. Next thing you want to do is decide what you want to achieve and how quickly. So maybe you'd like to look at what other people are doing in similar sized outfits, and take a bit of guidance on that. John Boxer, I think, is probably joining in with us for this seminar. He's done a very interesting bit of, he's the chair of our Action 2030 committee, and he's done a really interesting piece of benchmarking work to look at other organisations similar to CIEEM, and it's really interesting, you know, to see what small organisations like CIEEM are actually doing. Some of it's a bit disappointing, I have to say, but it was an interesting exercise. So that might be something that you'd want to do, try and find other outfits that are doing something similar and similar size. Then you might want to take a baseline year. This is what we used to do in the old days. We used to sort of use 1990 as the baseline year and then say, well, we want to cut our emissions by 50, 80%, whatever, by a certain year. That's quite tricky because it means you've got to sort of go back and try and find all of that information. And it might be that you have never gathered it in the past. So what people are tending to do these days is just to sort of say, well, I want to get to zero emissions as quick as possible. So a lot of organisations are choosing 2030. They want to set that as the year when they go to zero carbon, completely decarbonised by 2030. And if you did choose to that, you'd be in good company. I think there was a poll done in November 2019, I forget who actually did it, but they found that 56% of the UK public thought that that was a really good target to use. So you've got the vast number of people, the majority of people in the UK are behind that. And there's no end of organisations have adopted it as well. I clocked that Apple, Heathrow Airport, Church of England, lots of different local authorities. There's even parts of the country that have adopted it, you know, towns and districts and so on. And even Carlsberg have chosen to go to zero carbon by 2030. So if they can do it, then so can you. So set your target. Once you've got that, then you can get cracking with it. So start off with carbon emissions. Just remember that scope 1, these are emitters that are directly under your control. So if you own your boiler, own your vehicle, you might have a production plant, but you know, if you're not actually manufacturing anything, you haven't got to worry about that. So just get out there, find out how much gas or oil that the boiler's burning, or how many miles your vehicles are doing per month or year, what sort of fuel they use, and if you can find miles per gallon for the vehicles, that's great. Usually the manufacturers, they publish miles per gallon figures. So gather all of that stuff up, that's all useful information. Then you start working on your scope 2 emissions. So that's your electricity, that's your heating and your cooling supplies. So ask your energy supplier, have a look at your bills, speak to your landlord if he's supplying or she's supplying the heating and cooling or electricity. Look at the units of energy used in past years and start gathering all of that up. So how many kilowatt hours, how many tons of oil? I don't know, I don't buy oil, so I don't know what you buy that in, but you know, just gather up whatever you can. Ideally do it by month so that you can keep entering that information month by month or by quarter, whatever your bills are, and go as far back as you possibly can. So if you've got that information, do go back in time, because then you can start to look at a trend and you can really see how well you're doing over time. So next, this tricky old one, the scope 3 emissions. It's the hardest one. It's where you have least control. It's probably the one where most of your emissions will lie. So take the easier things like water usage. You might be on a water meter, or you might be able to look back at your water bills and get some information on that. Look at travel in leased cars. So if you haven't been doing it in the past, figure out what miles you're doing, or maybe your staff are using their own cars. Look back at their expenses. That might give you a clue as to how many miles they've done and what the journeys are like. You might be able to pick up on, you know, plane bookings, train bookings, and figure out who went where and when, and how many miles was associated with that. I mean, that's a bit of work there, but there's plenty of websites that will help you with figuring out carbon emissions in relation to air and train travel. Think about tonnage of different types of waste. Maybe you've got a waste contractor who picks this up and they can give you the information of what they've picked up, what tonnages of waste there are, and they might be able to split it into you know, landfill waste and general recyclable waste and so on. So you might get some clues there. As of now, make sure you get your staff to keep a travel log, and they keep a log of their miles, where they've travelled, what sort of transport. And just don't be put off. This is a lot of work, but if you can't find the information, don't give up on it. So focus on gathering whatever you can. If it's not 100%, then don't worry about it. You can always go back and fill gaps later on, but it really is better to start with what you can get hold of than to do nothing at all. That's my advice. So with scope 3, with what's left of it then, start to think about maybe you know, you're thinking now about your suppliers, you know, what things are you buying in, stationery, printer inks, you might be putting on events like CIEEM do, you know, think about what you spend your money on maybe, and pick the 5 biggest areas, 5 or 10, and go to your suppliers for those things and say to them, you know, what is the carbon emission associated with you giving me this product? So for your paper, maybe they publish that, you know, what was the carbon emissions over the life cycle of that paper? In that paper, getting from the tree to your printer, you know, what is the associated emissions? Because that's really what you're asking for. That's a tricky one, and there aren't very many suppliers who can provide that. If they can't provide it, maybe think about choosing a supplier that can, you know, because you've got some influence then, haven't you, within the supply chain. So you've got all of this stuff, you know, how much energy you use, you know, how much waste you're putting out, how much water you're using, where do you go, how do you go from that to what the carbon emissions are? Well, the government very helpfully publish a spreadsheet, it's an Excel spreadsheet with the emissions factors on, and they do that every year. You can Google it. We will put the link in this webinar, in the slides, but I think we can probably save it on the resources on the 2030 Action 2030 website as well, so you can go there for it as well. And it used to be an absolute nightmare trying to figure out what on earth it all meant, but these days there's an awful lot of narrative in there, and it's relatively easy to use, and it'll tell you how to convert from something like kilowatt hours into tons of carbon, or kilograms of waste or tons of waste, different types of waste and so on, into carbon emissions. So that's where you start. Have a little look at that. Have a look at it as soon as you can, because that will give you an idea of the sort of units you need to use for recording your energy, water, waste, and so on. So have a little look at that, and then once you've got to the end of all of that and you've figured it out for this year or last year or wherever you can get the information for, that is what you are left with. That's your carbon footprint, and then you need to start looking at offsetting schemes. Now, that you don't want to be looking at offsetting schemes. So your ideal situation by 2030 is that you simply have no carbon emissions. You probably will, but you really want to reduce the amount of emissions you've got. And if you do have to resort to offsetting, then try and look for schemes that are local and that will actually offset your carbon emissions in the same sort of timescale. So you'll be looking for schemes that don't just cure the problem that you've created in that 1 year in the next 50 years. You really want it to be matching your emissions, otherwise we're never going to solve the problems that we've got. But your target should be to avoid offsetting, really, and just to reduce your emissions to nothing. So you've done all of that. How do you get to this magic number of 0 by 2030? Well, start targeting the items with the greatest CO2 emissions. That will probably be in your scope 3, but you've got a picture by now, haven't you, of what the big emitters are and the things that you really need to start to address. You can start thinking about a plan. What can you do? Can you have more people working from home? Can you use hybrid cars? You know, whatever your issue is, can you reduce your waste somehow? Whatever your issue is, start making a plan to bring that down to 0 if you can. So that, you know, all of that hard work that you've done up until that point will give you an indication of where you need to put the effort in. And then finally, really, I suppose, report your findings, tell everybody what you're doing, and tell them what your plan is for next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and encourage other people to follow your lead. Make sure you publish it, you know, shout from the rooftops, put it on your website, put it on your Facebook page, put it on Twitter, Instagram, I don't know what all the different media are, but make sure everybody knows what you're doing. Because, you know, your clients, your members in the case of CIEEM, your customers, you know, all of your stakeholders are going to be enthused by what you're doing. And then next year, do it all again. And for your scope 3 then, you've picked your top 5 or your top 10, pick the next 5 and 10 and keep working away at it, because it really is quite a difficult area to be taking action. And just keep going. That's my final point really on that, on your process. Just keep going. And where you've got gaps, try and plug those gaps if you haven't got the information that you want. Just keep chipping away at it. So that's my recommendations for the process. Next thing you can do once you've got your carbon emissions sorted, well, you start looking at other areas of influence. So you can start looking at maybe your pensions, your pension provider. Where are your funds being invested? Are they going into the green sector? Or is your pension scheme funding gas or oil exploration? How about biodiversity? You know, can you consider a green roof on your office, or can you rewild parts of your estate? What can you do about that? Can you encourage your employees with some sort of bonus scheme, or, you know, in their annual reviews or something? Can you encourage people to reduce their footprints? Can you do a bulk purchase scheme for sound, insulation, or electric bikes, or, you know, what can you do to help your employees? What about your clients? You know, all of your stakeholders. You can really go to town on this. You can really shout from the rooftops about what you're doing and encourage everybody else. So it's a challenge. We need to challenge each other, really, help each other to go further, because this is such a serious crisis that we're facing. It doesn't need to be dull. You can start tomorrow, although that's Saturday, so I'll let you off, and you can start on Monday if you like. But think about it over the weekend, because honestly, it's that urgent. Time is really running out, and we all, every single one of us, needs to take a lot of action. Otherwise, we're sunk. Here's a few useful bits and pieces. So here's a few links which you'll have access to. So I've talked about the government's emission factors. Very useful. You will need this. You'll need to go into that and find out how you go from units of usage to emissions. The Carbon Trust have a carbon footprint calculator. It's free to use. It's pretty simple, but it's for a small business, and it's got a very straightforward set of sets of emissions for your data sets. When I was looking for resources that you might want to use, I came across this little company, Whole Grain Digital, who I think are a London-based digital marketing company, and they've got a useful little blog where they did a bit of benchmarking of all the different calculators, free ones, that you might be able to use. They didn't find anything that quite suited them, so they developed one online and sort of shared it with everybody. There's a template that you can use for your staff that you can download. So that's quite an interesting little blog just to read that. And I found Sea Level as well. They've produced a simple business carbon calculator, because I think they're involved with offsetting. And we will be developing, we need a spreadsheet ourselves within CIEEM, so we will be developing a spreadsheet tool in the next few weeks, and we will make that available to you as well. CIEEM's emissions aren't actually that difficult, and I'm going to hand over to Amber in a minute to explain why it's relatively straightforward, I suppose. But the trick with these carbon calculator spreadsheet tools is trying to make it relevant to everybody. So it'll take a little bit of work on our part, but we hope that you'll find that useful, and that you kind of come on the journey with us, really, so that we can all support each other. So I'd like to hand over to Amber now, just to tell us a little bit about CIEEM's emissions. It was a real surprise to me, I must admit, a good surprise really. So I'll leave Amber to tell you more about that.
Thanks, Melody. So when we set up our Action 2030 group, their first action was to review our existing environmental policy, which is available on our website, and agree a new scope for our net zero calculations. So as you can see from the diagram, we report 0 Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. This is because we do not own any pool vehicles, and we purchase 100% renewable electricity and certified green gas for our main office in Winchester. So as Melody said earlier, according to government guidelines, this can be reported as 0. But we do still measure the amount used to make sure that we're reducing use as much as possible. So the main thing of our environmental policy is to reduce, reuse, recycle, and then offset what we need to at the end. So all of our emissions that will be included in our net zero are recorded in Scope 3. So we haven't yet selected our sort of top 5 to focus on this year, but that would include a small national grid emissions factor for the renewable energy. Hopefully delegate travel. So if you attended the 2019 Scottish conference, we offered an option to input your details so we can offset your travel, and hopefully we'll use that going forward. Including staff and committee travel, which we've been doing for a few years anyway. Our in-practice production, which is probably one of the biggest areas for us. catering for events, staff commuting, waste management, energy uses of venues, and couriers, and our water usage. So many of the things that Melody's already covered. So the group have already provided several key recommendations on how we can reach our net zero as an institute. So these mostly focus around remote working and continued professional development options where possible. So obviously you'll know we've been thrust into a trial period a bit earlier than we were expecting because of COVID, but we think they've gone very well, and many of you might have joined the remote conferences, so it'd be good to get your feedback on that as well. And then other things are incentivising sustainable methods of commuting for our staff. So as I said earlier, there'll be an in practice article about this from Jean and Tamsin from our Action 2030 group in September's edition. And then influencing our pension provider. So we've put a template letter up on our website for you to use, and we've already contacted ours, basically just urging them to tell us a bit more about how they're reacting to these crises and how they're addressing both of them. As yet we have not had a response, but we'll keep pushing for one. And then finally, greening the office. So this is just making sure where we work is representative of what we're trying to achieve, and having as many wildflowers and things as we can. We're obviously in the centre of Winchester, so we're a bit limited, but trying our best. And that was it from me, so I'll hand back over
Thanks,
to
Amber. So we've got time maybe for a few more questions. Have we got any more?
Sorry, yep, we do have a couple come in. So there's one question: are there any guidelines on implementing this for a one-person business? I'm concerned with making anything I do effective rather than just generating reports.
That's a fair comment. Yeah, I'm not in favour of generating reports, but it's important to go through it methodically, I think. The scheme that I mentioned that the government are now running, I think there's an example of a two-person business there, and they all you need to do really is just to look at your energy usage, water usage, and so on in the way that I've described, and you know, it's the same process, but I would still report it because I still think that, you know, even as a one-man band, you're still going to have influence over other people that you interact with. So I would, it doesn't have to be a sort of 50-page document, does it? But, you know, you just declare to people what you're doing about it and try and enthuse them as well. So I would still encourage you to do it in this way, but, you know, it doesn't have to be a massive piece of work, does it?
Thank you. The next one is, do you have a list of zero carbon by 2030 pledges that you can share?
I haven't found anybody gathering them up, but I think...
Yeah, I think I might be able to answer this one.
Yeah.
So the Society...
Anyway, wouldn't it? For our benefit, yes.
The Society for the Environment and there's several other organisations, they're running a pledge to net zero. So I'm not sure who's signed up to that and sort of the sizes of organisations that have signed up to that yet, but that might be worth looking into. We haven't signed up to that as of yet because originally the net zero date was 2050, which doesn't line up with ours, but I think they may have changed it now, so that would be good to look at.
Cool. Anything else?
Yep. So how many did you want to take? Sorry, we're a little over time. But
are we? Okay. Well, perhaps we'll leave it there. What we thought we would do is that we will make a note of all of your questions, and thanks very much for asking them. And we'll put the answers on our website. So and I guess we could circulate it to everybody, could we as well?
Yes. Yeah, we should have a list of attendees.
So apologies if I am running a little over time. I apologise for that. But we'll let you all go and enjoy the weekend shortly. And we will answer the questions and get back to you on that. So thanks. So very quickly to summarise then, we've talked about climate change, global warming, increased carbon emissions, and diminished biodiversity. And I hope you're convinced by now that they're all very important. They're all going in the wrong direction pretty much, and they are all linked, and that we need urgent action by every one of us. We need urgent action to bring it all under control, and we've got this 1.5 degrees C target, and if we miss that, well, we're sunk really. So there are conventions for managing, monitoring and reporting on CO2 that have been around for a while. They've affected big companies, but now, you know, it's being brought down to the individual level. So Scope 1 emissions are for things that you can control, that you own on site. Scope 2 is for bought-in energy. And Scope 3 is pretty much for everything else, really. You know, it covers travel, purchased goods and staff commuting. We've covered a few other things as well. If you must offset what's left over, but your aim should be that there shouldn't be anything left over, but look at offsetting, because that's important, really. And take a step-by-step approach. Keep it simple, don't be discouraged, and just keep improving. Fill the gaps as you go along. And we've suggested a few useful tools and resources, and we'll put those on the CIEEM's website, because we're all in this together. So this is sort of like the final poll, really, that we'd like you to join in on. We just kept this sort of like high level, really, just to introduce you to the idea, but you know, we can do more if that's what you'd like. If you're just bored with it and just want to go off and do your own thing, that's fine as well. But we'd like to ask you, you know, whether further webinars on this subject would be helpful. And if so, if you think yes, click A, because you just want maybe to go in a little bit more detail about the high level stuff, you know, perhaps look at the scopes again, look at some particular examples. We could take you through an imaginary ecology business in more detail and put some imaginary figures in to show you how a carbon calculator might work. Or B, do you want to go away and have a little go at this and then think, you know, this is actually very hard and I'd like a bit more help. And we could come back into a detailed workshop where you could share some of the things that you've done and some of the difficulties you found. And we could work on this together, you know, as a group of people helping each other. Or C, no, you're right, actually, you know, you can go away and do this on your own. So those are your choices. So if you can click the buttons, let us know. How are we doing? Okay, so you'd like a little bit more. I'm saying that 39% of people feel they'd like a little bit more explanation. Perhaps we go through a better example step by step and then you can understand it better. A similar number perhaps think you need a detailed workshop. We can perhaps do that, you know, afterwards. And a third of you saying, no, you're right, you're okay with it. So that's great. Happy for those people. But I think for the rest of the people who've voted A and B, we can look to put something else on, can't we, Amber?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
I think something else, perhaps in a few months' time. Yeah, great. Well, that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a good weekend. Do have a think about all of this, and do make a start. Just think about what can you do. What can you do on Monday? That'll be your first step. Just think about all of this. Set your ground. Just set your targets and just get cracking. So great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Melody.